Well, happy Thanksgiving to you all. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Rick, for doing that Thanksgiving call to worship thing. That was good. Hope you all have a good Thanksgiving. Our church is, as you see from your bulletins, our church is going to celebrate Thanksgiving as a church family on the 27th of October. So this sermon and service has not anything to do with Thanksgiving. The 27th will be. So hope you can all make it for that service. I think it's fair to say that a struggle many people have is a struggle with patience. And not all people, but many, I think, struggle with that. I certainly do. At times, I don't like waiting. I want things to happen now. Came across a story about a thief who was not patient to his undoing. In Strasbourg, France, this sweet-toothed thief stole, among other things, some cookies, chocolates, and caramels, other candy from his ex-employer. However, he couldn't wait to enjoy his loot, so he started eating the caramels as he was making his getaway. And he was soon caught and arrested. And apparently the police just followed the trail of caramel wrappers right to his hideout and arrested him. So his impatience got him in a little trouble. And I think the world we're living in is making us more and more impatient. Everything is so fast-paced. From the food we eat, to the computers we have, to the online information that is there right now. If you want to know something, you can just Google it and you'll have the information you want within 2 seconds. It's all so instant. Everything is so instant. We're getting more and more used to getting what we want right now. And that, I think, breeds impatience. Back in the pioneer days, as one wag put it, if a man missed his stagecoach, he just shrugged his shoulders and said, oh well, another one will come along in a couple of weeks and catch that one. But now if a man misses even one section of the revolving door, he is ready to explode with impatience. I think impatience is a real problem in our spiritual lives as well. How often we fret as we wait for God to do things, to answer our prayers, to work in a situation that is out of our control. The great New England preacher from years ago, Philip Brooks, he was known by and large as a man of poise and extreme calm and steady demeanor. His intimate friends, though, they knew at times he suffered moments of frustration and irritability. And one day a friend saw him pacing the floor like a caged lion and asked him, what's the trouble? And he answered, the trouble is that I'm in a hurry and God isn't. And how many of us can relate to that? In our journey through the book of Genesis, now into studying the life of Abraham, we come today to chapter 16, which Keith read, which records an incident where Abram and his wife Sarai got impatient with God and decided to take things into their own hands, and the tragic results of that impatience. This section of Genesis that focuses on the life of Abraham is a study about learning to walk by faith. Abraham is learning how to do that. Like anything else, it's a process. Learning to walk by faith takes time. And there are slip-ups along the way. Abraham illustrates that for us. We've seen Abraham so far, we've seen him make great strides of growth in his faith. We've seen him slip up and lose a few steps. And then we've seen him make some more great strides forward. Chapter 16 is another slip-up, as impatience got the better of him and his wife. Learning patience is definitely something that needs to be learned if we're going to walk by faith. Last week we saw Abraham take a tremendous step of faith as we looked at chapter 15. Chapter 15 opened with the frustration Abraham was feeling by the fact that he still had no children, though God had promised him descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. And he took his frustrations to God, and God reassured him, God encouraged him. Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And we saw from that has always been and always will be the way to God, is through faith. It was a tremendous step of faith on Abraham's part. But this week we see Abraham and his wife, as the years pass by and there's still no child, we see them becoming impatient, waiting for God's promise, and they decide to take things into their own hands. It's amazing, isn't it, how it is often in the area of our greatest attainments that we have our greatest stumbles. So that's what Abram and Sarah found out here in chapter 16. So let's look into these verses and see what lessons we can learn and apply this to our lives. As Christians, we need to beware of the sin of impatience. And looking at the tragic results of impatience here in Genesis 16, it'll help us to be aware of this sin. So the first thing I see here is impatience can lead to sinful actions. Impatience can lead to sinful actions. As we put ourselves in Abram's shoes, I think we can all see good reasons for him to be impatient. And anyone in his place likely would have felt the same way. God had promised him that he would make of him a father, or he would be a father of a mighty nation. His descendants would be too numerous to count. He still had no children. He's getting old. We touched on these same frustrations in the same area last week. And last week we saw in chapter 15, Abram even suggested to God that his servant's son Eliezer could be his heir. But God told him no. He himself would have a son that would be his heir. From his own body, it says in chapter 15. But the frustration was that it just wasn't happening. Abram would have been 85 years old at this point. Sarah, 75. Chances are good that at that age they're not going to be having any children. So Sarai came to Abram with a suggestion. A way for him to have a son before he died. She was impatient, and maybe this passage is more about her impatience than Abram's, but I think they both were probably feeling the same frustrations. Sarah was impatient as well, as you can well imagine. Her husband was impatient, as we have seen, and is understandable. So Sarah came up with his answer to get God's promised son for Abram. She would give her maid to Abram, and through Hagar they could have a son. And they would adopt that son as their own, and that could be the answer to the problem. That's a bit shocking to us as Christians. I doubt if any Christian family walking with God would consider that kind of a solution. But this was something that was not unheard of in the culture and in the society which Abram and Sarah were living at that time. Archaeologists have discovered tablets from that time which indicate that it was lawful for a childless couple to gain children for themselves in this way. So Abram and Sarah would have known of this. It was lawful. They had seen or heard of it being done. It was acceptable in the society and culture in which they were living. Last week we saw that there also existed the practice of a childless couples of them adopting the oldest child born in their household, likely from one of their servants, and that child became their heir. So society at that time practiced a couple of different things to give a couple an heir if they couldn't have children of their own. Adopting a servant or having a child through one of the female servants. Abram had considered that first option. We saw that last week. But God said no to that option. He would have a child of his own body, God said, from his own flesh and blood. So now we're seeing Sarah and Abram considering the second option. If you're like me, one of the first thoughts that come to your mind was, how in all the world could Abram have considered such a thing, especially so soon after what took place in chapter 15? When God specifically said he would have a son of his own flesh and blood. Well, a couple things. First, although it is the next chapter in the book of Genesis, we don't know exactly how long the gap is between Genesis 15 and 16. It may well have been a couple of years, 3 years. And upon further consideration, Abraham could have reasoned that the promise of chapter 15 verse 4, that promise could have been fulfilled in this way. What was the promise in the covenant that God had made with Abraham? God said that he himself would have a son. God did not specifically say that Sarah would be the mother of the child. Just that he would have a son of his own flesh and blood, that he would be the father. That's what it said in chapter 15. So those were perhaps Abraham's reasonings that his frustrations led him to. And even though they may be reasonable from a human standpoint, it was still sinful. Even as we consider Sarah, we can see perhaps, if you stretch it, and I'm speculating here, this is not said in the Word, but I'm speculating. Maybe her motive was very unselfish. She's denying herself a great deal. She must have had a measure of faith to believe Abram was to have the seed promised by God. She just at this point was beyond believing that it could come through her. Maybe her motive was good, but the proposal was all wrong. Because Abram's taking of Hagar was adultery against God's institution of marriage set down back in Genesis chapter 2. It may have been practiced by the society of that time, but it was still sinful. We don't get our morals from the society around us. And you can't accomplish God's work with sinful actions, with sinful methods. Impatience in Abram and Sarah led to sinful actions. Isn't it amazing how Satan can trip us up? As we see here, he uses even the holiest of relationships, of marriage, and the closest of ties to bring about a sin. Friends, we better not be ignorant of his devices. It is possible for temptation to sin to come through very noble and selfless motives. Maybe even very noble and selfless motives of your spouse. Notice verse 2 says that Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. Verse 2, he listened to the voice of Sarah. He didn't consult God. He listened to his wife. Now, usually wives are very wise and worth listening to. We should all be listening to our wives. But after all, they are still human. They still have that sin nature. They're not always right. Abram should have listened to God and consulted God about this. So we see that impatience can lead to sinful actions. Abram and Sarah were impatient about God giving them their promised son, and their impatience led them to taking matters into their own hands, that God needs a little help here in getting this promise fulfilled, and that led them to sin. And the same thing can happen to us. Friends, impatience is something that I think, we're all familiar with this, especially in the spiritual realm. We have all fretted while we wait for God to work something out. But the lesson for us here is that we should never allow our impatience to cause us to do something that's sinful. And we need to be very careful, because impatience can warp our thinking and our sense of values. We're so desperate for some kind of solution, for the situation to be resolved, that sometimes we just get to thinking we have to do something, and we start doing things that just not right. We don't see straight anymore because of our impatience. Wrong begins to look right. It looks like it could be the answer to what we're facing, but it's sinful. It's not right. So we need to have patience. Remember that kid's song about patience? Have patience, have patience. Don't be in such a hurry. When you get impatient, you only start to worry. Remember that God is patient too, and think of all the times when others had to wait for you. I used to sing that song to my kids when they were fretting about things in their growing up years. They grew to hate that song. But it's a great song. Patience, friends. I don't know what kind of problems all of you are facing, but we need to have patience and wait for God's perfect timing. Allow Him to work it out in His way and in His time. Anything else is second best. Don't get caught in that trap of allowing your impatience to lead you to a solution that looks good but is wrong. Beware of impatience. It can lead to sinful actions. Secondly, sinful actions cause strained relationships. Sinful actions cause strained relationships. Sinful action causes a lot, but one of the things it causes is strained relations. Looking at second half of verse 4 through to verse 8. You can kind of skim along there. Well, actually, let's read it. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him. Chapter 16. Then He went into Hagar, she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarah said to Abram, may the wrong done me by you be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarah, behold, your maid is in your hand, in your power. Do what is good in your sight. So Sarah treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from? Where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah. Cause of strained relationships. Firstly, when the maid Hagar realized that she had conceived, she despised Sarah, her mistress, in her heart. Now, to understand why, we need to understand the times and the values of the times in which these people were living. For a woman, there is absolutely nothing worse than to go through life without bearing any children. That was the worst thing that could happen to a woman. To go through life childless, unable to bear a child. Barrenness was considered a curse from God. Women were not looked on in the same light as they are today. Their greatest contribution to their world was bearing children for their men. And if they couldn't do that, they were despised and looked down on. Now, there's no indication that Abram viewed Sarah in that light. We have every indication that Abram loved her deeply. But still, the barrenness was there. And I'm sure Sarah felt it very deeply. And after she had denied herself and let Abram take Hagar, her maid, and she got pregnant, it just got worse. Because now her maid despised her. Hagar thought in her heart, probably these were her thoughts, you know, she can't even give her husband a child. I have to do even that for her. It sounds like she was filled with pride and looking down on Sarah, her mistress. She, the servant girl, she was going to bear the great man Abram's child, something his wife couldn't do. And so she's gloating. And in her heart, she despised Sarah. And so Hagar, even though she's only a pawn, she's just being used by Sarah and Abraham. And she's not totally guiltless either. So as a result of this, of Hagar despising Sarah, Sarah came to Abraham and tried to lay the blame for everything on him. She said, may the wrong done me by Hagar be upon you, of all things. She came up with the idea, but then when it worked, and her maid began to despise her, then Abraham's supposed to take the blame for everything. It's a head shaker. It's amazing, isn't it? How when we sin and are faced with the consequences of our actions, we tend to lay the blame on somebody else. Very common reaction. This whole thing was Sarah's idea. But she tried to put the blame on Abram. And so often we do the same thing. We sin of our own free will, and when we are caught and are facing the consequences, we seek to blame somebody else or something else. Here are some of the common ways we put the blame on someone or something else when we get caught with our sin. Well, the devil made me do it. She seduced me, or he seduced me. You know, that person made me so mad, my temper just blew. Nobody could have resisted swearing and cursing after being around him for a day. I know it was wrong, but it's no wonder I did it, considering the kind of home I grew up in. And on and on. We can always come up with something or someone to blame. Listen, friends. When after we come to the Lord and accept Him as our Savior, when we sin as Christians, when we sin, it's always because we choose to. Sure, there are temptations. Of course, there are always temptations. But as Christians, we have the power through Jesus Christ to resist temptation if we want. So if we do sin, we did because we chose to and not because anybody or anything made us. It's our choice. So we need to remember that. So then Abraham in turn told Sarah that Hagar was her maid. Hagar was in her power, she should do with her what she wanted to. In other words, Abram said, she's your problem. You deal with it. I want none of my doing. I want nothing to do with this. Whatever going on between you two, that's your issue. You deal with it. Again, sounds familiar, doesn't it? It goes along with laying blame. We try to wash our hands of something that perhaps we've been a part of. Abram, in effect, was telling Sarah that it was her idea, it was her slave, it was her servant, it was her problem. It wasn't any of his concern. When indeed it was. Although it was Sarah's idea, Abram went along with it fully. So it was his problem. There is now a child on the way. That is Abram's child. But he sloughed it all off on Sarah. And the result of that was, as we read on, that Hagar, temporarily lifted from the status of a servant to the status of wife, was reduced back down again to the status of a servant girl. And Sarah, filled with jealousy and hatred of her, treated her harshly, so much so that under the burden, Hagar ran away. So we can see how sin snowballs. And the consequences get worse and worse and more complicated. When you take the path of sin, it gets out of control. It snowballs. And it will affect your relationships with those around you, straining them to the breaking limit. Friends, sin in your life, if left undealt with, will cause, among other things, it will cause strained relationships in your life. With your spouse, with your children, with your parents, with your friends. I don't think I need to tell any story to illustrate this. We can all think of probably many. It just snowballs. And this sin of Abram and Sarah is still snowballing. Because, as we're going to see in a minute, Hagar bore a son named Ishmael, who is the father of the Arabs. And we all know the enmity that still exists today between the Jews and the Arabs. Still extremely strained relationships. Friends, the consequences of the path of sin are deep and they're long-reaching. And they cause, among other things, strained relationships. And no matter what, they will leave scars that will never go away. A woman named Hazel Ferris told the following story. I'll just read it. She said, "During my early childhood, I had a fiery temper which often caused me to say or do unkind things. One day, after an argument had sent one of my playmates home in tears, my father told me that for each thoughtless and mean thing I did, he would drive a nail into our gatepost. Each time I did a kindness or a good deed, one nail would be removed. Months passed. Each time I entered our gate, I was reminded of the reasons for those ever-increasing nails, until finally getting them out became a challenge. At last, the wished-for day arrived, with only one more nail to get out of the gatepost. And as my father withdrew it, I danced around proudly, exclaiming, 'See, Daddy, the nails are all gone.' And the father gazed intently at the post as he thoughtfully replied, 'Yes, the nails are gone, but the scars remain.' Friends, sinful actions have far-reaching effects. Not the least of these is strained relationships that will snowball if they're left unchecked. And even if and when we do make things right, the scars remain. They're still there. That's something each one of us should consider when we're tempted by a sinful act. Be it out of impatience or something else. Stop and remember what the consequences are. Thirdly and finally, and this isn't really results, this is just another point that we see coming here. God can still work in human messes. That's the third point. God can still work in human messes. The rest of this chapter deals with Hagar and her plight. Although we've seen she's not entirely guiltless, we can greatly sympathize with Hagar. She's just a servant. She's just being used. That's all. She had no say in that matter. Servants didn't have any say. Neither Abram or Sarah considered her and her feelings and the consequences on her when they decided to get a child through her. So those are all circumstances beyond Hagar's control. She was being used, and now she's in trouble. And she could no longer bear the harsh, cruel treatment of Sarai, her master, so she ran away and stopped as it says there, by a spring in the wilderness. The spring that's on the way to Shur, it says. So from that information we can see that she was heading back home to Egypt. She was a slave from Egypt, likely when Abram and Sarai went down to Egypt a few chapters back, maybe one of the servant girls he had picked up there in Egypt. She's heading back home. She's heading back to Egypt. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to her at that spring. And this was apparently a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ. When you see that term in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord, in the Old Testament, it's referring to the pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ taking on the form of an angel. You know, of course, that we've talked about it in our adult Sunday school class, the Trinity. God exists in three persons, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. They've always been there. All three of them have always been there. They're all one. They're all distinct persons. We can't understand it. Don't try. Believe it. Just the way it is. So Jesus was in existence long before he was born in the manger. He had existence all along. He, in fact, John chapter 1 says he was the one who created everything. So apparently this is a visitation to Hagar by Jesus Christ himself. So the angel of the Lord, who is Jesus, asked her where she had come from, where she was going to. Not that Jesus didn't already know, but to make her think over her actions. And she answered, and the Lord told her to go back and submit to Sarah's authority. But he didn't stop there. And the Lord went on to tell her that she would in fact be the mother of many descendants through the child that she bore. He went on to tell her that she would have a son who would be named Ishmael because the Lord had taken heed of her affliction. The name Ishmael, that means God hears. That's what the meaning of the word Ishmael is. God hears. So her son would be named Ishmael because God heard and God took heed of her affliction. Isn't that good? God sees people who are afflicted. And the angel of the Lord goes on to tell Hagar that her son would be a wild donkey of a man. That's what it says. In most translations, the Old King James Bible says, it just says he'll be a wild man. The marginal note in my Bible says that this could actually be considered a compliment, since the wild donkey is actually the almost untamable onager, was an admired and valuable animal. So it could be considered a compliment in that sense. Verse 12 goes on further to say that his hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand would be against him. So untamable, probably a good apt description. And he would live to the east of his brothers. That's what it says in the New American Standard Bible. He would live to the east of his brothers. I noticed when Keith read, the NIV says he would live in hostility to his brothers. That last phrase in the Hebrew can be translated either ways, or two ways. It could either mean he would dwell to the east of his brothers, or that he'd live in defiance of his brothers. It could be translated either way from the original Hebrew. And they're both true. As you look at the history and the present day situation between the Arabs and the Israelites, they're both true. So with these words, the Lord comforted and encouraged Hagar in her plight. God had a plan for Hagar. God had a plan for her son Ishmael, which she bore. God, in his greatness, worked something out of the mess which Abram and Sarai created. And that tells us about the greatness of God. He can take the worst mess and by his sovereign hand create something good out of it. Commentator Griffith Thomas says, this is a great picture of real life. Man is seen as blundering, sinning, and suffering, and then God intervenes with his overruling providence and wisdom and grace. So a couple things I want us to see here. Firstly, God is a God who sees the afflicted. And look at Hagar there. Poor Hagar, totally used and ignored. Left on her own with a pregnancy that was not her idea, but God saw her and took note of her. God's like that. Don't ever imagine when you're down and out that God has forgotten you. We see from Scripture that God takes special notice of the afflicted and comes with encouragement and kindness. As one commentator said, Hagar was a lonely, friendless girl who, in her distress, was found by the one who treated her with the utmost tenderness. And that's how God is. I'd like to point out something interesting here. As Genesis goes on, we see God revealing more and more to Abram and his household, and to us, revealing more and more the truths about who he is. He doesn't do it all at once. He does it in stages. And he does it through the telling of these stories, of revealing the history. Here he reveals something to Hagar about who he is. And what kind of a God he is. He is the God who sees. Verses 13 and 14. He's the God who sees. That's the truth Hagar was struck with as you read the story here. God is a God who sees me. I can't believe I'm still alive after seeing the God who sees me. God is a God who sees things and sees people. He sees everything. Tells us something about God. That's the kind of God he is. Omniscient. God revealed this attribute of himself to his people here in Genesis chapter 16. He's a God who sees. There's a verse in 2 Chronicles chapter 16 I'd like you to show you. I'd like you to turn there in your Bibles, please. 2 Chronicles, I want to show this to you. 2 Chronicles chapter 16. Verse 9. 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 9. It says there, "For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his." You have acted foolishly in this. Indeed, from now on you will surely have wars. In the context there, God is speaking to King Asa, who had made a very foolish decision. And God is telling him this. So that's the context. But the truth is that the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. Asa's heart wasn't. And that's the rebuke that God had for Asa here. But that's the truth here. God's eyes are searching the earth so that he can support those whose hearts are his. He's a God who sees. He's looking. He's watching. And when he finds those whose hearts are his, he's there to support them. What a great truth about God and who God is. If you can sympathize, friend, with Hagar this morning because of a plight in your life, remember this. If your heart is God's, he will find you and he will strongly support you. Also, I want you to see how the Lord helped Hagar. He drew her mind away from the past, away from those past injuries, and drew her to think about things ahead. Her son. What he would become, how great he would become. And he brought her back to Abram and Sarai. Or maybe Sarah and Abram. But in so doing, God put Ishmael under Abram's responsibility so Hagar wouldn't have to raise a son alone in the middle of the desert. In our times of affliction, God very often, he won't take the affliction away, but he will help us refocus our minds. He will help us take care of our responsibilities. So again, I don't know this morning what kind of affliction you are struggling under, if any. But I do know that God takes special heed of the afflicted. If your heart is God's, he will see and he will give you strong support. He will help you refocus your thinking. He will make it bearable. And he will work something good out of the mess that you might be in. Make sure your heart is God's. If it's a mess of your own making by a sin you have committed, obviously you need to give your heart back to the Lord. You need to make things right. Come back to God. And then he will be there if your heart is his with all the support you need. So therefore we see from this passage the tragic results of the sin of impatience. We see, number one, it leads to sinful actions. Sinful actions, number two, lead to strained relationships. And then praise God, we can also see that God can still work in human messes. So friends, beware of impatience. If unchecked, it causes no end of trouble. Be patient. Let God in His perfect time, in His perfect way, work it out. If you have been impatient, you've fallen into a sin as a result of it, remember, we have a great God. Turn your heart back to Him, confess your sin, ask forgiveness, make it right, and then go on, knowing that God's eyes will seek you out and give you all the support you need, and that in His greatness, He can still work in the mess that has been created. Patience, friends, patience. Something we need to learn as we learn to walk by faith. Let's just bow our heads and just have a time of silence, and just allow God to speak to us. What's God saying to me personally this morning?